the record button. Yay, I remember. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special webinar on design thinking with Paul Pangaro. And Paul is going to be with us here, and he'll also be with us in San Antonio as part of the I3 core track of the National E-Extension Conference in March. And this is a session, this session is only offered to those of you who are part of the core. It will be recorded, so if some of you who are leading teams, your team members couldn't be here, the recording will be available. So let me tell you a little bit about Paul. Paul is a technology executive, a conversation theorist, an entrepreneur, and a teacher. He is the co-founder of Cybernetic Lifestyles, and he consults with organizations across the world. Some of his recent clients have included Zeit, Samsung, Nokia, and he can probably go on and tell more about that. But we're interested in Paul for helping to, as all of you have come to the core with projects, one of the things that we hope will happen is that you hear someone like Paul talk to you about how to rethink things using design thinking. And you may find something that will be very useful and help you as we move forward. And so with that, I'm going to turn the screen and everything over to Paul. Just a reminder that you've probably been muted, so we keep the noise down. If you want to speak, and when we have question and answer, simply unmute yourself. In the lower left-hand part of the screen in front of you, you'll see a microphone, and there's probably right now a red line through it. To open your microphone, just simply click on it at the appropriate time. Thank you again for being here, and now Paul Pangaro.
Thank you, Terry, and thanks to everyone. I wish I could be in the same room at the same time, but this technology seems to be working pretty well. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually, and I look forward to seeing you face-to-face in just a few weeks. I have some slides prepared, but I really want to emphasize that I've just pulled together some thoughts on design thinking and to give you a little context for it. And if we were in the same room at the same time, I would much rather make it a conversation. As you'll hear, that's very much my interest. So forgive me in this constraint of a video to be presenting some slides and talking through some ideas. And I look forward to questions. I'm not sure we can do it along the way. If Terry can open the channel, that would be great if there's time. Would love to have the chance to do that. I'll run through some slides and then we'll make some space to do that at the end. You know, design thinking is this phrase that's in the air. It's been in the air everywhere for some years now, certainly in my world. And it's a very important idea. But I think like all, you know, fashions, it comes from somewhere. And I'd like to just mention a little bit about that, not much. But it also points to a future, a way of improving and a way of doing better. And I'd like to give some hints about what I think that would be. I won't be able to go into depth here with that, but there'll be time when we're together in San Antonio to really do some practice work along the way. So if everybody can hear me okay, I can't tell, of course, but I assume it's okay. Terry, we on a good footing here so far?
You're on a great footing, Paul. Thank you.
Good, great. So thanks to everyone. So design thinking really came out of a perspective that thinking systemically was very valuable. This started really after World War II and had a number of different ways of manifesting itself. This particular diagram came out of a Club of Rome that was trying to look systemically at how cities and populations and climates operate. It's a matter of, you know, what are the components and how do they interact? There was a movement in the late 60s of professional designers saying, you know, this design thing, it's not just all vague and intuitive. We can make a routine out of it. We can make a method or a methodology out of it. And so there were some books published in that area. Herb Simon wrote this extraordinary book that's still quite influential from the 70s called Sciences of the Artificial, artificial in the sense of man-made, human-made, rather than natural or biologically made or what have you. And he attempted to routinize design in a scientific way. But then much more recently, these guys from IDEO, you probably heard of this story, design firm, it's been around, I think, 20 years. And they've made a practice of design thinking, and they've also made it, I think, famous, one could say. And they look at it as this intersection point of technology. What can I make? What's feasible? What's viable in a business situation? What can we make a profit from and create a viable economic model from? But ultimately, and of course, perhaps most importantly, what human values can we bring such that we're making useful things for people every day? And in fact, these things can even be desirable. Of course, Apple is now the classic example of the most desirable hardware on the planet. So in various books they've written and in this company that they founded, IDEO pushed the idea of design thinking. This also became part of the D School, D for Design, which is part of Stanford, where we look at a design process and we break that process, which is otherwise in some smart person's head, and we make it a routine, and we can examine what the pieces are, and we can make the pieces better. This is the sense in which it's a systemic approach. I look at design as a system of these steps. I understand something, I observe it, I visualize it in some way, I make an example, I see how I'm doing. This kind of iterative process is also important. And at the Institute for Design in Chicago, it's also been very prominent. So this is a way of saying that many large institutions have taken this very seriously and have taught it or used it every day in their design practices. In the case of IDEO, is a very well-regarded product and service design company. And indeed, the Rotman School, business schools have also taken it on. Now, of course, what is it? I hope you were waiting for that, and it wasn't too hard to get to this point. What is it? Perhaps the most important thing to say is that design thinking contrasts with analytical thinking or business thinking or rational nuts and bolts kinds of thinking. Of course, you want the flourish of design. You want something to look beautiful. And historically, designers, this is the cliche, it isn't completely true. Historically, designers are the folks who come in at the end. So you get your business people, they figure out what's economically viable, you get your engineers, they build something, and then toward the end you get the designer in there to make it look good. Of course, it wasn't really always that way, but that's the cliche. And that's what design thinking is trying to counter. And this is important for a couple of different reasons. One is designers are in the process from the start. They're in those first conversations. You don't bring them in at the end to make stuff look good. They're thinking strategically and economically and socially and technologically too, all along the way, to make sure that this idea that we're making something that has business value and human value all at the same time. So a major, I think, transition that design thinking brought almost more than anything else was this idea of starting from the user, starting from the human. Other phrases for this are things like human-centered design or user research, looking at what human beings do in their day-to-day context. Contextual research is another name for it, was one of the innovations of design thinking. So designers at the beginning, but understanding users and thinking about human beings and needs and so on. The next bullet, open and inclusive process. So it's not as if you wait for the design at the end, as I've said a couple of times, but rather all of these different points of view, business, technology, human, design, creativity, analytics, are all in the process the whole way. Also, brainstorming was an important new element in this idea where, and you all know what brainstorming is, I don't have to explain it. And the other thing that happened because of technological advances is this idea of rapid prototyping. So prototyping is where you make an early example of something that may not be complete, and it may not be made out of the materials you want, and it's certainly not finished, but then you can give it to someone and they can use it. And based on observation of that use, you can come back and say, well, what worked and what didn't work? So then you change it, and then you give it to users again. And this iterative cycle, very, very important. So what you might do is whenever you hear design thinking, in your mind, think about these elements, because this is what the transition to design thinking really brought. Now, there's a business argument for this. You know, in order to succeed, we need to innovate. Innovation equals design thinking. It's just that simple. And therefore, business success equals design thinking. Now, we have to be careful with this because there have been many, many claims about design thinking, and some of them have been, frankly, exaggerated. So just because you practice design thinking doesn't guarantee that you get an innovation, right? Depends on so many, many other factors. But sometimes it's marketed as if it's that simple. And this is a little caveat about that. One of the reasons why it implies that is because you would think that, well, I have this process, right? I have design thinking. I have designers at the beginning. I do some brainstorming. Sorry, designers at the beginning. User research, talk to users. Brainstorming, prototyping, iterating. That's all I need, right? Well, again, it's not that simple, and it really can't be generalized that much. So one has to be a little cautious about the promise of design thinking. Many, many improvements, much better than what we had before, but not a be-all and end-all, not a miracle. So I'd like to go back over design thinking and rethink it a little bit, and then try to push the envelope a little bit. So again, this process is thought to be these steps. You can call it whatever you like. But I observe users. I understand human needs. We get together. We do Post-it notes. We figure out what's possible. We decide on something to make. We make it, and then we see how we do with that making. Ethnography is a fancy name for what's been done for quite a long time among anthropologists, of course. Watching human beings in their context. You don't bring them into the lab behind the screen and look at them like lab rats, but you watch them in their everyday work. Brainstorming, of course, open-ended idea generation, making, and testing. So I think this is all pretty clear. But of course, there's an evaluation moment, right? It's not just we make something and we say, well, that was good, and we're done. But you have to have a reason for saying what we just made wasn't as good or was better than the one before. And so how we judge what's better is a very important part of this. And that implies values. What are our human values? This is better because people waste less time. This is better because it's more enjoyable. This is better because it steers people toward what is better for them. Dangerous ground. But certainly this design choice makes them more aware of the consequences of their decisions as human beings. That would be a good thing. Maybe it teaches them something and so on. But you don't get brainstorming and prototyping for free is what I'm trying to say. You have to know what you want and what your preferences are and what your values are. So values ultimately are what are central to design. So what are the limitations of design thinking? Well, as I've been implying along the way, how specific is this sequence? It's pretty general. It's more like a meta level of what you do rather than a specific step by step. And how do we know rigorously whether we're improving or not? That comes back to values and measures and so on. And is it repeatable? So how clear is it, quantifiable and directed? Is it a little sort of technical nitty gritty, but if it's a true methodology, then it should be capable of withstanding these kinds of criticisms. We okay so far, Terry? Sound okay and everything?
Everything's great, Paul.
Terry's probably on mute. Okay, great.
No,
good.
Everything's great.
Good. So I'd like to offer a rethinking based on my work and the work of colleagues and so on, and wanting to push the envelope, always trying to say, can we make it better? That's what designers do, right? We always want to make things better no matter what we have. I want to go sideways for a second and point out something that I think is a very beautiful observation, which is if we think about great design examples, you may not know these by name. Certainly you know the bottom one, right? Apple for sure. And you may not know these individuals along the way, except perhaps Steve Jobs. But these are extraordinarily successful design relationships in the history of product design and software design and industrial design in the 20th century. They were all collaborations. The claim would be, therefore, by sort of existence proof, that if you had only one of these guys, it wouldn't give you the same result. So this is a hint that the conversation from multiple viewpoints is absolutely critical to great design and great innovation. So with that hint in mind, perhaps this first step in wanting to create new things, wanting to bring innovation, is to pay attention to what the conversation is. Design the conversation. And I'll come back to exactly what I mean by that in a moment. I'll get much more tangible. Brainstorming, of course, can be all over the map. That's what's great about it. We all have equal say. We can go anywhere. But, you know, after a while, it's kind of all over the map. So could we take in our domain, for example, if I'm a product designer and I'm building a piece of software, or if I'm interested in food chain or whatever it is it may be, can I narrow down and focus on a very, very hard but problem that has a boundary in it, a beginning and an end? And can we focus on that? And if we nail that, then we can expand it out to a wider and wider scope. So instead of trying to boil the ocean, solve the whole problem, let's narrow it down to a fragment that is difficult. And if we solve it, we get something good out of it, but we can make progress on. So that's the proposal for replacing the broadest possible brainstorming to a narrowed focus. One can talk about the context in which these things make sense. Nowadays, it's not just making things smaller, cheaper, faster. There's information in everything. There's a digital component to everything. Someone the other day says, well, there's no digital component to this piece of paper. And I pointed down to the corner of the piece of paper. There was a link at the bottom of the page. There was a URL. So everything is touched by digital and by technology. And I think this has to be importantly remembered. And we also need a problem that's consistent with who we are. Again, values. What are our values? What do we want to conserve? What do we want to bring forward? What are we willing to give up in order to get something new? And finally, prototyping the solution is still a very necessary step. And how we iterate and evaluate this, how we measure it, how we converge on design goals, these are all components. And ultimately, this is a conversation to agree on the means to get what we want because we've defined it. So that's another little segment. It's a reframing of design thinking to be focused on conversation and a narrow problem that we then iterate on. Now, I want to flash some things at you. I don't want to scare you because I can't explain all of this now. Conversation on a means to achieve a goal is, of course, only part of a larger context. What is our goal? How do we determine what our goal is? And so if we're rethinking design thinking and we know that we have to have a conversation to figure out how we're going to get what we want, we also need a conversation. What do we want? What are our goals? And how are they consistent with our values and so on? And again, I'm not going to go into these. These are part of a larger framework, which we may be getting to. I need to give you the whole architecture and not just leave it at a simplification. Now, a conversation to agree on goals is really about creating something new, and creating something new means creating a new language. Again, that's very dense and packed, and I apologize for it. But I would claim that, for example, this thing called an iPhone, people say, well, that's a new piece of technology. It is. But before it was a piece of technology, it had to be an idea. And expressing that idea requires a new way of thinking, which requires a new way of languaging, creating language. And so that's another component. And ultimately, of course, all of these fit together into how do we design the designing. So again, I'm going to leave it at that and now drop back down and be more specific. But the general claim.
Paul, can I interrupt you for just a minute?
Please do.
I just want to remind everyone that if they do have a question as Paul is moving through his presentation, please use the chat pod and drop any questions in there, and then we'll make sure that he gets them answered. I forgot to do that at the beginning, and I know you want to make this as interactive as possible. So that's all I want. I don't want to interrupt it.
Great, Terry. I appreciate that. And call my attention to it if I miss it, but I have the chat.
Okay, great. Great.
Okay. So as you hear in general, my view is that designing is conversing, that there are all of these different kinds of conversation in this sort of framework in which we're negotiating, understanding one another, disagreeing with one another, saying, I have this preference because my value is to conserve the environment, to worry about sustainability, to care about whatever it may be, economic disparity, whatever your values are. I'm talking very generally. And when we meet, we can talk very, very specifically about your values and how they come into what you want to do. But it's always about the conversation. We learn through conversation. We generate new ideas through conversation, and we collaborate. We coordinate our actions through conversation. And that's why this framework is so conversation heavy. So one of the things we've talked about, or I've mentioned a few times, is this idea that we have to design the conversation. And I want to walk you through, again, a set of slides for a different context, which I'm repurposing here. I'm going to show you something that I think when we get to the end of it, you're going to say, well, that was obvious. And that's a good thing, because it means I've articulated something that is important for its simplicity and yet also important to make obvious so that we do it more carefully. For example, usually what happens is we have a project, we make a team, the team meets every Monday at 10 o'clock. We spend 3 hours together. A lot of it is a waste of time. Some of us are on our devices. And then we do the work during the week. Well, that can work in some cases, but I'd like to propose thinking for a moment about what a successful conversation is. What's a good conversation as opposed to a bad conversation, and then how do we design a good one? So you'll notice here, do you see my mouse, by the way? Probably not.
Yes, no, yes, we can see it.
You do, excellent. So here we have the idea of a conversation with participants. So these little characters in the lower left are people in the conversation. And if it's an effective conversation, something new comes out of it. So there's a new idea, or we learn something new, or we make a simple decision. Hey, we better meet twice as often. Because if we don't meet twice as often, we're not going to do very well. Now, what we usually forget is that this new knowledge establishes a goal for the next conversation. Fine, that's great. Again, obvious. But let's be very, very introspective about that and understand how we can make that next conversation better. How do we define the conversation? Well, this new knowledge we have suggests how we might choose who the participants are in the next conversation. For example, we may say, well, that was great, it was really good, but we need somebody who's an expert in X. Or we don't need this person anymore. We're going to bring them back in a couple of weeks. But right now we're on our path, and the path says, in order to achieve the goals of the next conversation, we need a different set of participants. So what I'm claiming here is that if we're conscious of where the conversation is going and what we need in each subsequent conversation, we can design the conversation. So how do we decide who's in the next conversation? Well, we have participants that are possible. So we have this roster of people that we know, or even just roles that we know, or expertise that we know. And then we can decide what are the skills, who has those skills, who's available, and then we design the participants of the next conversation. So far, so good. It's just being very, very careful to decide who's in each conversation, to be efficient so that we don't have people that we don't need, and effective so that we add people that we do need in order to advance the conversation. Okay, so we're not done. We're almost done, but we're not done. Because the other thing that happened in this first conversation is we generated knowledge, but now we know that we need external information into the next conversation. So it's like saying, before we meet next time, let's get those stats on how it worked last month. Or let's ask this colleague, in his experience, how did it work when he did it in another company, or whatever it may be. So this dark area is this self-consciousness of saying, who do we need and what information do we need so that the next conversation is as effective as possible. Make sense? It's in some sense a very simple idea, but I see that people don't do it consciously. They don't design the conversation. They design the team, so they get 5 people, 10 people, 20 people in the room, and those same people in the room every time if they're available. But by being more conscious, I would claim that we can design better, and our design thinking processes will be better because we'll have the right people in the room. So So what's so important about conversation? Well, if we don't agree, then we can't act together, right? So we can't coordinate our actions. If we repeat our actions over time, we have a relationship together, and that leads to trust. And of course, trust is necessary for us to feel comfortable to bring about change. Because if I'm nervous, I'm not going to want to change. If I'm trusting and confident that we can understand each other and that we can come to agreements and that we can work together, then I'm much more liable to be open to big change. The other point, of course, is that change is necessary for innovation. And if change is necessary for innovation, then conversation and agreement lead in that path. And innovation itself requires new language. Innovation, I would say, is a new language. And we create new language in conversation. So I apologize, very dense, a lot of stuff going on there. I'm happy to make these slides available after the talk. But it's another way of emphasizing how important conversation is, because it's the means to the end of all of these things in a kind of cadence or cascade that I think is very important. So that's the sequence. That's where we are. I'm going to leave this slide up so that.
Paul, Chris has a question in the chat.
Oh, wonderful.
And you said you had it up. Do you see it?
Yes, great question.
I should say her question, in case anybody can't see it, is, can you give an example that illustrates how a design conversation yields better results than a straightforward planning and implementation process?
Great question. I think in a couple of different ways. One of the implications of planning and implementation is that it's in these two separate steps. And we can plan and think and think and think, but it's not until we make something do we really understand what can be made, what do we want to make, and does it work? So one of the components of design thinking, this idea of rapid prototyping, trying it, changing it, trying it, changing it, is a key element. And as I started to say, technology makes that easy today. It's partly a mindset, but it's partly that we can build things and change them very, very rapidly because they tend to have digital components. So the separation of planning and implementation is one way in which the design conversation, this umbrella of conversing, deciding, conversing, deciding, conversing, deciding, part of the iteration is very, very important. But the other thing is that conversation constantly brings into possibility a new and better way. Again, planning and implementation may seem like it's separating. So the classic example now, to come to a specific example, is that of software startups. So 30 years ago in tech, what you did was you planned, and then you built something, and then you put it into the world 18 months later, a piece of software, and then you saw whether it worked or not. And of course, because of that long cycle, you were very, very careful and very, very rigorous and very, very slow every step of the way because you separated it out. Let's say, for example, you were building an accounting package that was going to run on a local PC in your home or business. Now what happens is the software startup throws something together very, very quickly in conversation and then beta tests it. This is the whole beta concept. Now, you may not think about it, but the beta test is a conversation. The beta test is a conversation between the users and the designer makers. And they're in this constant flux of seeing what worked, what didn't work, what can we change, what do we keep because we did it correctly, and making it version 2, version 3, version 4. So beta and versioning is already a kind of conversational model. So nowadays, you get version 1 of an accounting package, and it's kind of okay, but it doesn't take 6 months or 18 months to change it because of this constant conversation between the designer makers and the users to version 2 to version 3 to version 4. It's in constant update. And this much faster cycle, you could say, is part of the design thinking idea that we get it out there fast and then we try it. But this is true in many, many different it's kind of new philosophy, if you will. Even the product design people at IDEO will tell you that they'll make a version of something. It might be a toothbrush, and then they'll give it to somebody to try. And it's not about planning and then implementing, but it's this very, very tight cycle. Does that answer it a bit, Terry? Or Chris, sorry.
If we're Paul, if we're entirely in the Q&A section now, I was going to say,
Yeah.
also, if folks want to use, if you click on the participants button down at the bottom, there's a raise hand feature there. That might be good for us to sort of use that to maybe add some method to the madness. If folks, you can use chat, so please use that. But also, if you'd like to speak or share a thought, maybe let's try using the raise hand button, and myself, Terry, or Luann maybe will manage that piece.
And I'm going to say, if Paul, if this is the end of your PowerPoint, we could also stop sharing your screen, and then we can see everyone. We'll have everyone turn their cameras on if you'd like to do that.
That's a great idea.
Well, but while we're doing that, I actually, this is great stuff, Paul. I've done software development and testing for about 10 years now, and it's interesting you mentioned that old way, that client server model. I started in the early 2000s, late 90s, and you had to install software. Yeah, you had this long 18-month cycle of a new version would be released, whereas I've been doing web development for about 5 years now, and generally a lot of places work in 2-week sprints. So
exactly.
your release cycle is about every two weeks. So.
Yep. So it's this constant reflection. It's an opportunity to say, we did this. What did we do? How did it go? Do we want to do it differently? And this is a conversation, I would say. Great. Thank you, Mark.
This is Chris. I had another question. Maybe, Terry, you can field it, because I don't know everybody on this call. But in cooperative extension, using a logic model is kind of a standard practice. And I'm wondering how that's different, similar or different from what you're describing with designing conversations. Terry, do you feel like you could answer that, or is there somebody else?
I put it out, and I asked Jerry Thomas to respond to that question. Jerry, would you mind?
Sure. My understanding of it, and listening to Paul and reading other sources, is Paul's description of a technology company. The way they used to design stuff is very similar to our logic models. It spends a lot of time on the planning. It's like some of the old, what they used to call waterfall planning, where you had to do one step before another step and then another step. They were all in a linear, sequential order, where when I look at design theory, and what Paul is talking about is we're moving much more towards testing things. We're developing a prototype or an experiment of something, seeing how that works, using that feedback from that, and to make other decisions. So we're moving away from spending a lot of time planning this sort of chronological linear planning where we have to really have every step down, and realizing that we don't have time for that, and in many of these situations it may not work. So Paul, that's my understanding. Logic models are very linear models for extension and education programming, where we already think we know the outcomes.
Yes, it sounds like the right fit. I want to go back just for a second, because this helps me go back and sort of make more sense of what I said and pull out examples here. This idea of a focusing problem is very important here. When you know that it's going to take you 18 months, as I said earlier, and you know that when you release, you have to have the whole thing, this makes you very conservative. It makes you spend a lot of time on requirements, on specifications, on dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And that conservatism makes the conservatism worse, if you will, right? It makes you spend more time being careful, and that's why you get the long cycle. In a way, we flipped it. And it's like, let's not worry about the details. Let's get something out there that we can put in the hands of people and see what happens. Because the design conversation is more generative, richer, more effective, probably faster, and so on. But we can't put out there a solution to everything fast, right? We can't do everything and iterate quickly on solving the whole problem. That's why we have to pick this focusing problem, narrowing it down so that we're doing something significant. And I can speak on another occasion about the qualities of a focusing problem and how to choose one. It's not easy. You want something that's hard enough such that if you solve it, you've done something. You've done some kernel of difficulty. And you can then generalize that out, as I said earlier. But it has to be something that you can actually do in, maybe not in a 2-week sprint, as Mark just said, but maybe in 6 weeks or in 3 months. I have a colleague whose entire business is going into very, very large, multi-billion-dollar corporations and giving them a startup model. And the hardest problem they have is in this early phase where you have to get the managers and the executives to give up trying to do everything and to pick something small enough that it can be done. So anyway, I just wanted to circle back in the reason why focusing problems, because you can't throw out something fast and test it if you're trying to solve the entire space.
Paul, we've got a question in the chat pod from Duncan Hilchey, also known as owner in the chat pod. We don't know why. How do you do an interactive and iterative feedback process in designing a program that doesn't wear out stakeholders who may be impatient? This may sound quick, but such a process takes time, doesn't it?
It's a very, very sophisticated question, if I can put it that way. Obviously, the voice of experience speaking. It's hard. It's hard because the stakeholders want to solve the problem. And I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that you really have to make them comfortable with the process. And maybe the only way to do that is to put them in a one-day session where they go from user idea, user research, brainstorming to product proposal. I mean, literally try to do a design in a day. Because if they live through that, first of all, they see that it can be done. They realize that in one day they can't do something that's significant and it's going to take many days. But it's hard to get them to do it purely on faith. So stakeholder management, as you all know, is a big issue. On the other hand, and again, this is a very sophisticated second comment, it sounds quick, but it ain't. Of course it isn't quick. But, and maybe Mark can speak to this, there is a satisfaction in the rapid iteration cycle. So you feel like you're making progress. You really learn something when you decide on what to make, you make it, and then you try it with people. It's something very, very exciting about that. And then you see that the value of the rapid iteration is far greater than trying to solve a much, much bigger problem. But no easy answer.
Yeah, so I was going to say it really, again, in the old days of software development, you required on product managers gathering requirements. So they were talking to maybe a small subset of users and getting feedback. But the great thing with, sprints, 2-week sprints is the term that's used in the software development world. And those sprints are great because you get immediate feedback from a very large group of people. And if something's great, you hear about it. But if something's bad, you hear about it too, and you can very quickly change that or maybe roll back a change that was made.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think we have another question. Can one accomplish some of the testing via thought experiments rather than in the field? Another great question. Absolutely. In fact, in every world, it's perhaps easiest to talk about in the software world, there are many, many levels of fidelity to the prototype. So the least highest fidelity, the most crude, is called a card sort. You write stuff on pieces of paper and you give people the cards and then they sort them. It sounds trivial. But in fact, you're getting a sense of how they think about the information hierarchy in this world that you're asking them to define. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more specific example from your world. But then there's, screenshots, wireframes, clickable prototypes, full mock-ups. And again, it's not every feature of every part of the program, but it's that hard part. It's the kernel. Everybody knows you can do a login screen. Everybody knows you can share with email, right, or to Facebook or whatever. You don't have to worry about those. What's the core thing that's new about this product that is the innovation, is the thing that has the greatest value? Work on that, field that. So in short, yes. I would make one caveat though. Thought experiment implies that it's only in your head. And unless it comes out and is tangible and we can all look at it, and we can all be sure that we're talking about the same thing because it's written down and it's concrete, then yes, there are many possible ways of doing it. And of course, when you're having a conversation with users, putting something in front of them is absolutely the best thing. And it can happen very, very quickly. And there are many different ways of doing it. But great question. Another one, Mark. I'm wondering if anyone has an example from cooperative extension world of this rapid prototyping or program development. That's a great question. Have people used the techniques that you're hearing about, or even design thinking for that matter?
Gary, is Paul Hill on the call?
I do not see Paul.
I don't see. Paul's at Utah State. He's used, I know, like a lean startup method that's sort of similar, where they're designing to do some of his programming, I think, around some work with youth around code camps and things like that. I don't have the details, but I know he's been using that and discussing it. We've looked at that in other settings too.
Fantastic.
This is Chris. I have two examples, but they're not from cooperative extension, but I think they're close enough. So one is in my time at Michigan State University and MSU Global, when we were designing different approaches to sharing open educational resources. And we wanted to do around food safety, and the ultimate goal was to do a whole food safety certification program. We wanted to try out different ways of delivering that. So rather than pick one and do the whole program and then deliver that and then have to start over or revise a whole program, we took lessons or modules, topical pieces. We did them in a couple of different formats, and we tried them out with pilot groups. And then we gathered data to see which was most effective, what type of resources did it take to deliver it, and could we scale it up. And so, testing program modules or lessons with different audiences or using different delivery technologies, a really good example of this sort of iterative approach. A second one is, regarding thought experiments. Something that's in between that I experienced was a 2-day process like this that was part of what was called a Green Ideas event. And there were 4 different teams trying to start new businesses. I was on the one that was trying to do export lavender essential oil. Another one was trying to make like an experiential history museum exhibit. And after we went through the design process and did our Post-it note rounds and our, gathering data, doing Post-it notes, coming up with our initial thing to try, we went into the room that had Play-Doh, pipe cleaners, crayons, Post-it notes, foam balls, feathers, just stuff, craft supplies. And we had to use those craft supplies to do a prototype or a walkthrough of our experience. So the people doing the museum exhibit, took a table and they actually made it like for dolls, right? Like miniature size. They showed how the people would go through the path and what would be in it. And they used that as like a prop to tell the story during their pitch. Everybody gathered around their table and they explained their story and they brought it to life using, these props just for imagination, but to make it physically tangible. And our essential oil thing did the same thing. So every group, whether it was a physical thing they were making, a program, or a piece of software, used the same supplies to create an exhibit, a pretend something that could help them tell the story enough to get feedback from other people before they did their next iteration. Mm-hmm. And it was fun, and it was lightweight, took the pressure off, and it really worked. It was surprisingly effective.
It's a very wonderful component, actually. They teach that at the B School, as it turns out, in Stanford, which is how do you make physical the things that you're talking about. A silly example, but I think you see what I mean. Great example, Chris. Thank you. We have another owner question. Can some examples be aggregated and shared with i3 Core? That's a Chris question, I believe.
I'd say absolutely, but I think we're going to need your help scouting these out, because there are 30-something people on the call, and you guys are some of the most innovative folks in the system. Working on real projects, and we'd love to collect these. So I think we need kind of like a campaign to start collect them. We know some people in the system we've highlighted in our innovation quest last summer. People that are funded as innovation fellows and partners and learning networks have resources. So yeah, I think that would be worthwhile, starting to gather those in a place, a spot, on the web or in the Slack channel that you can, be inspired by these ideas. Also, the plan for March is between now and March and at the March event is to, help unlock some of these examples for your own consideration. Some of you are going after major projects, and maybe there's a piece you can peel off as an experiment to test out an idea or test 2 different versions, before you go bigger. And some of you might actually want to go through a design process, not to derail what you're currently planned necessarily, but to be able to explore, use your time with us to explore another way to look at it that might indeed influence what you're implementing with us as a core member. So, good question.
I will start a new Slack channel and invite everyone to it. It will be called Design Thinking, and we can put those examples there.
That's great.
Okay.
And there's also something I think to be learned in small conversations, looking at those examples and saying, well, this is similar to this, but this is different. And this worked better. Why did that work better? And to try to categorize them. And then those categories become a useful entry point for other members of Extension who say, well, I'm one of these. What's most similar that might help me? It's a way of making the reuse of other people's experience more interesting, more effective. Other questions? Crystal Powers has said, we are hoping to do something like this as our I3 core project. So looking forward to sharing our process and learning from case studies. Fantastic. Great. Other questions, other reflections? Any cries of?
Well, I just have a question based on what Jerry said about logic models.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if these are these mutually exclusive processes? Like, does this take the place of a logic model, which is probably impossible for most of us because it's required by our, management group to put everything in that format. So I'm wondering in what ways we can develop to create enhancements or multiple versions of the logic model based on different design iterations. Or I think we need to figure out a way to build these things together so that they strengthen each other and not try to compete with the logic model, because that's a culture change that isn't likely to be influenced by the core members by themselves. So bringing these things together, we might look for opportunities for complementary use of both techniques.
I think that's a wonderful question because it lets us take the advantage of both. And as you say, we're not going to lose the logic models. But what can design thinking bring to it? What I would say is, how do we design logic models? Can we bring this design thinking process to the creation of these models so that we know that they're the most robust, the most effective, the most comprehensive? And I think one of the ways we do that is we, again, break down the problem into focusing subproblems. So we don't try to do an entire thing, but we take subset of what we need to solve, and we do the brainstorming and the iteration, and we kind of prototype it. So if our logic model were this, how would that operate? And then we would ask someone to simulate that, to do a thought experiment about how it would work for our proposed logic model. And then we would say, well, that worked in some ways and didn't in other ways. So to focus the design thinking light on the logic models might be a nice way of taking advantage of both.
Yeah, one part of the logic model is the assumptions on which your inputs and your outputs are based. So maybe varying your assumptions in that part of the process would shed some light on differentiation that might be useful in the design.
That's a great idea. That's a wonderful starting point. I like that very much.
We have some more comments in the chat pod from Becky Griffin. It sounds like design thinking would be helpful when dealing with the different dynamics of different counties within Extension. Want to react to that, Paul, or any others want to react to that?
I think certainly because it's sensitive to the situation that you're interested in solving the problem on. It's not a cookie cutter. It's kind of the reverse of a cookie cutter, where you're looking at, in this case, the users would be the different counties, a particular set of dynamics, and we could examine those from a design thinking point of view and then brainstorm about what's effective and what's not, and then propose prototype design changes for what they are. So it feels that to me. But anyone else have a thought? Okay.
And then from David Campbell, I assume involving the target population in the discussions would be helpful. In one possible scenario, we might get our target population to be involved in different stages, but not all. This is not a well-formed question, but we may not have the same team throughout the design thinking process.
Great question again. If you've heard me say this before, you'll be surprised. It's about being deliberate. So in the same way that we design this sequence of conversations, we design every subsequent conversation. We should think carefully, who are the users or the target populations that we're interested in entirely? Well, that's quite a diverse group. Let's focus on this narrower group for certain reasons, because they're not the most difficult, but not the easiest, because they have the most critical problems, because they're the most articulate, whatever it may be. We pick a set. And then we operate the process on those, and then we prototype and do proposals and work with them to go toward a solution. And then if we think we've got a pretty good solution for that population, we expand the population. And then we test again, and we expand the population and test again. So again, not boiling the ocean, not solving it for everybody all at once. And startups do this too. When you're looking outside of a startup, you don't think about it this way, but the venture capitalists will make you think about it this way. Believe me, I've had them breathing down my neck. If you're trying to do it for this big an audience, they say no. You say, all right, I'm going to focus on this audience. They say no. And you say, I'm going to focus on this audience. They say, okay, fine. Solve it for them and then expand it out, because they know that that's the best way to get there. But so it's a great question again.
Crystal's wondering if we have any more resources available on focusing on a design problem. So shall we also try to compile some of those to offer them later in a document?
Yes.
Or maybe the Slack channel, the new Slack channel.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think sharing resources is really good, but it sounds like David Campbell, Becky Griffin, and Crystal Powers, am I correct in thinking you might be interested in pursuing a conversation with Paul? Maybe we could get the three of you and your teams together with Paul and maybe a couple others, and actually do a deep dive into what you're thinking might be possible for your projects and using a process like this. Would that be interesting?
Be fantastic from my point of view.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that, put your name in the chat window. So we can follow up and actually not only provide resources, which are going to be useful, but if you really want to give something a try, that's what we're working with Paul to do, is to support you in your process with your project as a core member.
So Becky Griffin said yes. Joanna Macy, it's moving too fast. David Campbell, yes. We have a bunch of people interested.
We'll be sure to save that chat, Paul, and we can coordinate that.
That'd be great.
Oh, we just designed, is that a good outcome of a conversation? And now we get to design the next one?
Yeah, it is.
Bravo. That's fantastic. That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you for observing.
We learned fast, Paul. We learned fast.
Obviously. Great. I'm excited. No, this is going to be a lot of fun.
So I hate to be the one who has to alert us to, we have about 4 more minutes of Paul's time and your time. So this is the time to ask any more questions or make any more observations. Paul, you have a great group of folks here. This is about 1/3 of our core. And every one of them is involved in either a team or individual project related to food systems or climate. Right. And some of them, they're all at various stages of their project. Some are well established, some are just getting started. And so any parting words that you would have beyond what you've shared today?
Well, I appreciate the invitation. First of all, I look forward to meeting you face to face, which is so much more fun and valuable, I think, in terms of how it feels and building trust and getting to know each other. It's not rocket surgery, I like to say. It's a new idea maybe, and it feels like it's in contradiction maybe to logic models or whatever. But it's so organic and natural that once you do it a few times, it becomes part of how you think. And I think once we get a chance to do those exercises together, you'll see how straight. It doesn't make inventing new ideas easy, because inventing new ideas is hard work, but it gives us a way forward. It gives us a kind of confidence and a feeling of progress by breaking it down, by always being in collaboration, by going there together and in a trusted way. I think is quite satisfying in the many projects that I've done in this way. And so I just invite you to stay open-minded about it, and to always give feedback and to always say what's clear and what's not clear. The responsibility of a conversation is that, right? But I think together we can do some great work, and I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate all of your time.
Yeah, I think I'm on my way to Hobby Lobby to buy feathers and pipe cleaners, right?
Okay.
So we can do that.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I would remind everyone, if you are interested in working more closely with Paul over the next few weeks, as Chris described, be sure to put your name in the chat. And if you don't make that, send a note to either Luann or myself, and we'll make sure that he knows about that and we get that organized. And anything else anybody has to add at this point? I'll stop our recording.
I'll just say I've captured Crystal, Becky Griffin, Catherine Idzorek, I'll get that eventually, Joanna, David Campbell, and Aaron as the people who said they wanted to form a future conversation with Paul. I think we'll call it a design learning circle, for lack of a better idea, and we'll get you all together. If there's anybody else that I missed, please just type your name there in the chat pod before you go.
And then anyone who happens to watch this recording, that invitation is out there for you as well. So please let Luann or me know that you're interested, and we'll get that rolling.
And I'll send this informal slide deck to everyone I have an email for, and you can redistribute.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
There are hours up, and we know that because the birds are chirping again.
Are you keeping the Zoom room open for a few minutes for miscellaneous?
We're stopping the recording, and then we'll move on to the Q&As regarding the core.
Great. Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Look forward to meeting you all, and to our next session. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.